Here we are at the state capitol, here in the bustling city of Honolulu, as we celebrate our 4th of July weekend at New Hope. Now, we're going to start here in Honolulu. We'll end here at the state capitol. But in the meantime, I want you to take a tour with me, a brief journey to our nation's capital, back to the roots of our heritage and the principles upon which we were founded, back to the very heart of what started our country's pulse. Now, our forefathers were wise to follow the instructions of the patriarchs of old to ensure that the people of Israel would never forget their faith or how God worked tremendous miracles among them. Our forefathers knew that if we were to remember who we were, well, they'd have to inscribe those values and those ideologies in stone and in sacred documents so that we would never stray. It would be like the altars in the wilderness of which Joshua talks about when he says, "There will be a sign among you," so that when your children ask later, saying, "What do these stones mean?" you shall tell them. You see, one of the greatest faults of the Israelites was that they kept forgetting who they were. They left their roots and started to drift. Again and again, both Moses and Joshua would bring them back to the word remember. But even though the altars were built and stones were inscribed, they would yet forget and they would stray. But now we have an example in history. And sometimes history goes in cycles, repeats itself. And being a good historian will make you a wise prophet of things to come. We're not unlike the Israelites because we often forget. We forget the eternal flame that protected us and gave us the motivation to cross the Atlantic, to begin that first colony in Jamestown in 1607. Pilgrims were like Puritans. They came so that they could be free to live their faith and serve God, to not only believe in God, but to live according to what they believed. But come, let's take a tour of some of those stone altars, as it were, so that we would never forget who we are. Written in stone, in granite, and indelible documents, we will find our identity. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. These three men, these early Americans, immortalized in our nation's capital, have left an indelible mark on our country, one that cannot be erased. On the shore of Washington, D.C.'s tidal basin stands the statue of Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence and our nation's third president. On the walls of the structure which houses him are carved the inspirational words he spoke and wrote over his lifetime.
No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship or ministry, or shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief. But all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion.
Jefferson believed in the freedom of religion, not in the secularization of all things public. He allowed the U.S. Capitol and other government buildings to be used for church services, and he wrote the first education plan adopted by the District of Columbia, which used the Bible and a hymnal to teach reading to students.
God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God?
Thomas Jefferson's statue looks to the north, into the White House, perhaps to remind its residents for ages to come that the unalienable rights of the people are indeed endowed by our Creator. Between those two sites stands the tallest building in the Capitol, the Washington Monument. This obelisk is dedicated to the victorious Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution and the country's first president.
It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God and to obey His will.
At his inauguration, at the end of the oath, Washington added the phrase, "So help me God." His was a life full of faith, and fittingly, so is the memorial from its cornerstone, in which is a holy Bible, to its capstone, which reads Laus Deo, Latin for Praise be to God. To the west of the Washington Monument is memorialized the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Though his life was cut short, his legacy surpasses many. Lincoln led the U.S. through a bloody civil war, which left more than 620,000 dead. In the midst of the fighting, the president wrote,
"If I had my way, this war would never have been commenced. If I had been allowed my way, this war would have been ended before this. But we find it still continues, and we must believe that He permits it for some wise purpose of His own, mysterious and unknown to us, and though with our limited understanding we may not be able to comprehend it, yet we cannot but believe that He who made the world still governs it."
Carved into the stone wall at the Lincoln Memorial is the President's second inaugural address. The speech mentions God 14 times and quotes from the Bible twice. This sermon-like message concludes with a charge that speaks to us still today.
With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to finish the work we are in.
So when we look at these memorials, we mustn't see illegal references to religion, though in time there will be those that try to have them removed as such. We must see the wisdom of God spoken through our forefathers, and we must heed the warnings of those that laid our nation's foundation. We must secure the liberties that have been gifted to us, not by our founding fathers, but by our Heavenly Father. Today we have the privilege of 4 individuals speaking to us from very different perspectives about our great country. These 4 will include David Barton, who's the founder of Wall Builders. We have Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, Colonel Oliver North, a veteran, and Sean Hannity from Fox News. Each of these will bring a different observation of how we can live in this country. First of all, David Barton, founder of Wall Builders. He's going to give us a historical walk to the foundations of our country, the principles upon which we were built, and why we exist.
When you talk about building America as a Christian nation, one of the biggest things is you have to define the term. Because as opponents define it today, oh, you're trying to exclude everyone who's not a Christian. You're trying to create a theocracy. You're trying to say you can't be an office holder unless you're a Christian. None of that applies. That is never the definition. The Founding Fathers were very intentional about a Christian nation, but they were also very deliberate in saying don't ever confuse America as a Christian nation with European Christian nations. The European Christian nations had state-established religions. In America, you always got your choice. A Christian nation was defined very well. In 1892, the U.S. Supreme Court gave a unanimous decision saying that America is a Christian nation. 3 years later, Justice on the Supreme Court said, we've been that for 200 years, but I'm not sure that today's generation still knows what that term means. So he wrote a book defining that. And he said, in what sense can we be called a Christian nation? Not in the sense that everyone here is a Christian, because it's never been that way. He said a Christian nation is one whose society, whose culture, and whose institutions have been shaped and formed by principles of Christianity. The Founding Fathers pointed out that Christianity is what shaped the free market economic system. It's what shaped our republican forms of government. It's what gave us the rights of conscience, because Jesus said, hey, a lot of people won't agree, but you do not coerce your faith on anyone. It's Christianity who said, we'll just tell you, and you make your choice, but we're not going to force you. That was a state-established church that did that. That was never Jesus or Christianity. So all these great freedoms that America enjoys were produced by Christian teachers and Christian leaders. The first written constitution in America was done by the Reverend Thomas Hooker in 1638. Historians today say the U.S. Constitution is directly a descendant of that. The first written Bill of Rights to give limits on government was done by the Reverend Nathaniel Ward back in the 1640s. We have the Bill of Rights today. I mean, these things came from Christian teachings, Christian principles, but we never forced people to be Christians. Americans, and specifically American Christians, have to be educated on this, because this is the big club that's used to beat them back in the corner. Anytime they stand up and try to let their voice be heard, oh, you can't do that. Separation of church. Wait a minute. Okay, let's say there is a separation. Number one, it's not in the Constitution. So does your judicial doctrine of separation trump my right to free exercise of religion? Does your judicial doctrine trump my right to free speech? Does your judicial doctrine trump my right to the right of association, that I can be with a group that I want to and we can express ourselves? No, it doesn't. And one of the things that I argue that really people don't seem to understand is, why don't we treat religious speech like free speech? See, we'll let anybody say anything on any grounds, as offensive as it may be, but if you say something respectfully religious, oh no, separate, you got to shut your mouth. You don't have the right to free speech, because separation of church and state. And it's really, we are now at the point where we do self-censorship more than anything. Oh, I can't say that, separation of church. I can't say that at school. You know, I'm a religious kid at school, but I go to a public school, separation of church and state. I can't say anything about my faith in public. I can't say that at the pulpit. You know, I'm a pastor, separation of church and state. I can't start talking about government policy. When did you lose your right to free speech just because you're a Christian? And if we don't get past that point, that we have constitutional guarantees that are there, we have judicial doctrines and secular doctrines that try to tell us the Constitution doesn't apply. If we don't get back to saying, you know what, I'm going to stand, I'm going to be bold, I'm going to share my faith, I'm going to share it publicly, I'm going to express my opinion publicly on issues of faith, and I have the constitutional right to do so. If we don't start standing up like that, we will get ourselves completely pushed out of the public arena. We're already pretty irrelevant right now by our own self-censorship, and if we allow them to continue to intimidate us out, we won't be salt or light any longer in America.
Colonel Oliver North has gone through various experiences, highs and lows, being accused, being exonerated. But through all of his experience, he's come to grips with us as a great country and the need for faith. We've heard it said there are no atheists in foxholes.
All true.
And you've seen how when death looms close, God becomes real. And you've seen some miracles out on the front line. Tell us about a couple of those.
Well, look, there's, you know, I don't pretend to comprehend everything that goes on around me, but I put it in the context of prayers being answered. I've, as you know, a son-in-law who's the pastor of a church, and he'll pick me up at the airport when I get back from one of these long missions overseas, and he'll email me a lot when I'm over there and remind me every day that my wife, my children, my children's mates, and my grandchildren are praying for me. I've seen it countless times when others around me are killed or wounded, and I've been able to relatively unscathed. I've seen conversions on the battlefield. I've seen young men that perhaps had never thought of it before, motivated by not just death and destruction, but by visual evidence of prayers being answered in ways that we can understand them. And not all of them are answered the way we understand. They're all answered, but not necessarily the way we understand that they're going to be. I've seen youngsters baptized. In fact, in my 45, 47 years around the military, I've never seen so many Bible studies, so many youngsters willing to simply kneel and pray, so many youngsters willing to go to chapel service. Don't have enough chaplains, but when the chaplains do get out there, they're overwhelmed by the response. And some of my colleagues in the media would say, well, that's because they're so desperate. No, they're not desperate. They've come to know where they're going and why they're going there, and they simply want to provide visual evidence of it. And I get to hang around with a lot of people who know where they're going and know why they're going there.
Former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, is an author and a brilliant observer of America. He's going to speak to us on how we began to slide from the foundations of our beginnings, how we got where we are, and what we should do from this point on.
I believe that we have been in a fight in which there is a secular left-wing elite in the academic world, in the news media, in Hollywood, in the bureaucracies, in the judgeships, and they have been trying to design an America that I believe is fundamentally false. 91% of the country believes we should have the right to say one nation under God as part of the Pledge of Allegiance.
Right.
Now, if you're in the secular left and you're in that 9% that doesn't agree, you are down deep terrified that if somebody comes along and actually mobilizes all 91%, that they will change the world you're trying to create. Remember, we've had a 44-year cycle, starting with the prayer school decision of 1963, consciously aimed at driving God out of American life. This is why I wrote Rediscovering God in America, is to draw a line in the sand and say, this is fundamentally wrong. It is a denial of the core values of the American system to do this. If I could say to every American, don't trust my judgment, come to Washington with me. Now let's start at the National Archives, where a political document, not a religious document, says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I want to make 2 points with this. Point number 1, how do you explain America if you're not willing to explain Creator? Where do your rights come from? Are we randomly gathered protoplasm, slightly smarter than rhinoceroses? Or in fact, as our founding fathers said in our initial document, are we endowed by God with rights which we then loan to the state? That's why the Constitution begins, we the people of the United States of America. Not we the bureaucrats, not we the lawyers, not we the politicians. And it's because we are the only society in history that says power comes from God directly to you as a person, and then you loan power to the government. It's the second point that we need to really educate people about. The pursuit of happiness, which Jefferson uses, was a Scottish Enlightenment term that meant virtue and wisdom. It did not mean hedonism. It did not mean the pursuit of pleasure. It meant that a person who truly, in a mature way, wanted to be happy would lead a disciplined and a committed life and would seek virtue and wisdom, and that was the base of freedom. That if people could not govern themselves individually, then they could not govern themselves as a nation.
Sean Hannity is a news commentator with Fox News, and he's going to give us some hope in America. Even though we may be surrounded by negative circumstances and some legislation that may be anti or against our faith, nevertheless, there is great hope.
Everything in life, I think, is somewhat cyclical. In our own personal lives, you and I have discussed this Catholic conscience that we both sort of grew up with here. I sort of refer to it as a spiritual homeostasis, where you're going through your life, you sort of gear off course, and you just pulled back to your center and your roots and your value system. And sometimes even on a bigger picture, larger scale, a country can be pulled off course a little bit. But even something like 9/11, as horrible as it was, and we lose all these people, you see goodness on a grand scale. I'll never forget, there were lunch shops that would open for free for all the workers on 9/11.
Wow.
These companies were offering food and medicine and supplies. We made mistakes at Katrina, but the American people were sending food, water, diapers, blankets, baby formula.
We went over there ourselves.
They're there to rebuild. I think America has, and Americans have, an inherent goodness in them. And we have, I don't care where you look in the world, where there's liberty, where there is freedom, there probably was an American soldier. We have paid the price for freedom and liberty, the blood, the sweat, the tears, the financial burden over the years. I think America has paid that price. What would this world look like but for the United States of America?
Yeah.
Think about that. What would this world be like without us? And I'm sick of America bashing. I'm sick of what takes place at the UN. I think there is a world that is unappreciative of the goodness of the American people. And this transcends all political lines. Democrats, Republican, liberal, red, blue, forget all that. Americans as a people have been the most generous, kindest people that have sacrificed much for the rest of the world. America has been and continues to be and will forever be the greatest force for good that God ever gave man. This is the greatest country God ever gave man. And we all have an obligation to preserve, protect, and defend it. And yeah, we're imperfect. You know what? Yeah, we need to spend more time on our knees, a little more humility, a little more time in prayer, more reflection, more introspection. But I also believe that, you know, we always will go back to that homeostasis, that spiritual center, because it is in our DNA. It is who we are as Americans. And, you know, there will be defining moments where we need to turn back quickly and hard and strong, and we'll do it.
There's an old and common adage that says politicians solve the problems of today, but it's leaders who solve the problems of tomorrow. And tomorrow comes sooner than we often anticipate. But in order to protect the future for our children, for our country, it will mean that we must become accurate historians of yesterday, as to remember why we exist and what brought us to this place. And why become great historians and accurate historians? I'll tell you why. Because history has an audacious habit of repeating itself. And if we'll remember well, we'll lead and live well. However, we're soon realizing that the ideal of our country has changed. The very core of the foundation of our country is shifting. The sands have changed. And we as Christians are now being reminded that we've got to return to not just the roots of our country, but the roots of our heritage as people of faith. You see, while our history may be straying, we cannot. And if our government is ungodly, it doesn't mean we must be. You see, for many decades, we've depended on our governmental leaders and our laws to guide us, trusting that our laws will be righteous. But now we realize that's not necessarily the case. We must return to God and Him alone to guide us, for He alone is righteous. But we've depended on our laws to tell us right from wrong. They no longer will. So we must allow this era to drive us back to God and His Word, which never, ever changes. It will be God and His Word that'll instruct us. In the past, we depended on our government to model character and leadership. It's no longer the case. So, we must return to the only source that's dependable, God and His Word. So how then shall we live? Come with me back again to another beginning point, in Hawaii, where our first Constitution was penned and a foundation was laid. It was in 1840 that King Kamehameha III penned our very first Hawaii State Constitution. It was a very fair constitution, and it held in it the same sentiments that began our country's heritage, in that it was based on the Word of God. It was a fair constitution, and it held the rights of the people, and it began like this. God hath made of one blood all nations of men to dwell.
Pau I ke koko ho'okahi. E noho like lako ma ka honua nei me ke kuikahi a me ka pō maikai. Ua haawi mai noho I ke akua I ke kahi mau vaivai like no na kanaka a pau me na ali'i a pau o na aina a pau loa. E ho'omalu ia no na kanaka a pau o ke lapule o ki ia pule. I ko lako ho'omana ana ia Yehova. A me ko lako malama ana iaia, I like me ko lako manao, aole nae e ho'opaia ke kanaka no kona malama ole ana I ke akua. Ke hana ino ole oia I ke kahi kanaka, a ho'opoino I ke au
on the kingdom. Now the state motto was first spoken in 1843, 3 years later, when Hawaii was restored after a 5-month illegal occupation by the British. King Kamehameha repeated the words of Queen Keopuolani, for this is exactly what she had said some years before when she was baptized into the Christian faith. Uamo ke ea o ka aina I ka pono. The life of the land is perpetuated or sustained in righteousness. In other words, it was a blessing as much as a warning. that if we strayed from the righteousness of God, our land would suffer. But if we stayed with the righteousness of God, we would be blessed. These were the same sentiments of the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville, who in 1831 began writing about democracy in America. He wondered why this young country had so quickly become such an influential and prosperous nation. He searched the colleges, he searched Congress, the halls of our government, our factories, even our music halls. But it wasn't until he visited the churches of America, with its pulpits aflame with righteousness, that he found his answer. And he writes, "America is great because America is good. And if America ever stops being good, America will stop being great."
Some time ago, I had a conversation with a Marxist economist from China. He was coming to the end of a Fulbright fellowship here in Boston. And I asked him if he had learned anything that was surprising or unexpected. And without any hesitation, he said, "Yeah, I had no idea how critical religion is to the functioning of democracy. The reason why democracy works," he said, "is not because the government was designed to oversee what everybody does, but rather democracy works because most people, most of the time, voluntarily choose to obey the law. And in your past, most Americans attended a church or a synagogue every week, and they were taught there by people who they respected. My friend went on to say that Americans followed these rules because they had come to believe that they weren't just accountable to society, they were accountable to God. My Chinese friend heightened a vague but nagging concern I've harbored inside, that as religion loses its influence over the lives of Americans, what will happen to our democracy? Where are the institutions that are going to teach the next generation of Americans that they too need to voluntarily choose to obey the laws? Because if you take away religion, you can't hire enough police.
Our state motto encapsulates that very principle. Yet we're so quickly realizing that the very core of America's principles have changed, and the sands of time have shifted. We can no longer expect the majorities to subscribe to righteousness or faith, to acknowledge God or even give Him thanks. What was once a given no longer is, and our expectations will need to change. And what will tend to confuse us the most will be the divergent voices from within the people of faith. But don't be distracted. Even though there is an increasing number of churches following the route of pleasing men, emptying themselves of truth or biblical theology, listen, even though there are fewer churches reproducing disciples who know the difference between right and wrong, you stay strong. Because you see, in an effort to diminish any feelings of conviction for actions, churches are removing certain behaviors from the sin list so as to not offend people. And so we will quickly recognize that often in these times, the gospel may not be changing people as much as people are changing the gospel. But it's never too late to stand up as the people of God. Did you know that although the world may push you to bend your faith, did you know that if you do, they'll despise you? I know it's funny, but it's sort of like this. It's like playing an opposing team in soccer who's playing so dirty that they're bullies. And so because of that, after a while, you just sort of let them score. So they come running down with the ball and you stand aside and let them score, because maybe if you let them score, they won't bully you so much. Well, after a while, after they've scored 5, 6, now 10 and 15, and they start realizing that you're throwing the game just so they won't bully you, they'll start to despise you. At first, it's like, woo, we scored. But after a while, they'll look at you and say, you're supposed to be opposing us. Otherwise, this is not any game. This is not soccer. Now listen carefully. Even the world expects us to stand true to our God. Don't throw the game. And when the future comes, we will look back at this time in America as a time when there was a lot of opposition. But if we throw the game, as it were, so that they won't bully us or so that we'll blend in or be liked by them, this will be a time in America where people will look back and see the slide of the church. We've got to adjust the way we think. See, this is not an era to be discouraged, but in actuality, it's a time when we are to be driven back to God. A time when we realize that our society, or the majority of people, even our government, can no longer hold the eternal flame of right and wrong. Only God can do that. And we must not be discouraged when men or societies can't live up to that ideal. It's time for each of us to not depend on man, but on God. If you call on God in your distress, He will answer you, and He will come to your rescue. He will be with you in the times of trouble, and He will deliver you. The Lord will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways, and He will not let any harm befall you, and no disaster to come near your household. The psalmist says, "Praise be to the Lord God, the God of Israel, who alone does marvelous deeds." Set the Lord always before you. You will not be shaken. Don't expect man or laws to do that for you. Constitution won't. Someone once said to me, "Wayne, fear God and you'll fear nothing else. Fear man and you'll begin to fear everything else." So let me leave you with this scripture on this 4th of July weekend. New Hope, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight.